We are in 2 Samuel 10 today. Now it happened afterwards that the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun his son became king in his place. Then David said, I will show kindness to Hanun, the son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent some of his servants to console him concerning his father. But when David's servants came to the land of the Ammonites, the princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun, their lord, do you think that David is honoring your father because he has sent consolers to you? Has David not sent his servants to you in order to search the city, to spy it out, and to overthrow it? So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half of their beards and cut off their garments in the middle as far as their hips and sent them away. When they told it to David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly humiliated. And the king said, stay at Jericho until your beards grow, and then return. Now when the sons of Ammon saw that they had become odious to David, the sons of Ammon sent and hired the Arameans of Beth Rehob and the Arameans of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Maacah with 1,000 men, and the men of Tob with 12,000 men. When David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the army, the mighty men, and the sons of Ammon came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the city, while the Arameans of Zobah and of Rehob and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in the field. Now when Joab saw that the battle was set against him in front and in the rear, he selected from all the choice men of Israel and arrayed them against the Arameans. But the remainder of the people he placed at the hand of Abishai his brother, and he arrayed them against the sons of Ammon. And he said, if the Arameans are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the sons of Ammon are too strong for you, then I will come to help you. Be strong, and let us show ourselves courageous for the sake of our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what is good in his sight. So Joab and the people who were with him drew near to the battle against the Arameans, and they fled before him. When the sons of Ammon saw that the Arameans fled, they also fled before Abishai and entered the city. Then Joab returned from fighting against the sons of Ammon and came to Jerusalem. When the Arameans saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together. And Hadadezer sent and brought out the Arameans who were beyond the river, and they came to Helam. And Shobach, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, led them. Now when it was told David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to Helam. And the Arameans arrayed themselves to meet David and fought against him. But the Arameans fled before Israel, and David killed 700 charioteers of the Arameans and 40,000 horsemen, and struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. When all the king's servants of Hadadezer saw that they were defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and served them. So the Arameans feared to help the sons of Ammon anymore.
Shabbat Shalom. We find ourselves in chapter 10 of 2 Samuel. And, before I get into the message, I wanted to show you a slide of kind of where we are in as we progress through the book of 2 Samuel. This is chapter 10. As we may recall, looking back, we have events that have taken place that have shown us who God's person is, the man after his own heart, King David. So chapters 1 through 5 really show David's rise, the rise of King David. But as we get to chapters 5 and 6, we see not only God's person, but God's place And that place is revealed to be Jerusalem, the place that God had promised to place his name there, where he would dwell. And so we see that come to fruition as David moves the Ark of the Covenant right into Jerusalem. And then we reach maybe the climax of David's life and the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel with God's promise in chapter 7. His great promise to David of an eternal kingdom and a throne and a descendant upon that throne forever. What an amazing thing, and David could only stand in awe of God's great promise. Chapter 8, chapter 9 sort of are the kind of afterglow of that wonderful promise as we see David defeating his enemies, really fulfillment of what God had promised, that he would have relief from all his enemies. And now we get to the next chunk of the book. That was sort of the first major movement of 2 Samuel, but the rest of the book, really, chapters 9 through 20, thereabouts, are really the story of the life of David in his kingdom. And as we shall see, this turns out to be what I call the time of David's tsuris. David is going to really get into some trouble, and he's just going to have trouble for the rest of his tenure as king. Does this undo God's great promise? No, because God's promises are not going to ever be overturned. It might affect David's enjoyment of God's promise, but it won't end what God has begun in his life. But now we arrive at a little portion starting in chapter 10, which I think it takes us through chapter 12. Kind of within that bigger scope of David's tsuris, we kind of arrive at the heart of what causes all the problems. And that will certainly come out next chapter, chapter 11, as we see in the middle of those three passages, David's sin, David's great sin against Bathsheba and her husband Uriah, and really against the Lord. And of course, God's response to David's sin. That's chapter 11 and into chapter 12. But on either side of that, there's this battle going on. There's this war between the Ammonites. Well, Israel is fighting the Ammonites, and the Arameans are thrown in there for good measure. And then we go back and fight some more with the Ammonites at the end of chapter 12. So that's what leads us here. And so you might wonder, well, why is this chapter where it is? And if you were to read chapter 10 on its own, you might think, well, that's kind of nice. No battle is an easy thing. and what we'll see is this is also very critical, the battles he fights in this chapter. But it's also exactly not necessarily kind of the big star of the show chapter. Chapter 7, you had God's great promise. Chapter 11 and chapter 12, you've got David's great sin and God's response to that. Those are kind of the highlights of the book of Samuel. And this is kind of an in-between chapter. Some people might overlook this and just think, well, okay, it's another chronicle of some of David's battles. Maybe they pulled these from the archives for filler, just to go between the two important chapters. But I just want us to stop and say, no, let's not rush by this and assume this is unimportant information. It's placed here for a reason. And I think something that struck me was that no chapter is insignificant in the book of Samuel. And, we're not just reading through a chronology of events so that we're swept along by the current of history kind of helplessly, but the author, with intention, has placed this chapter here for a reason. So the question we have to ask is, why is this here, and what is God trying to say to us through this? This kind of reminds me of, as an artist, I don't have any slides of artwork for you, but and that's because some of the artists I want to talk about are contemporary artists, and probably their work is copyrighted and the video would be taken off of YouTube. But there are many artists that I admire in my life that are actually not really flashy artists. One of these artists is Andrew Wyeth. He just paints very kind of ordinary scenes around him on his farm and in his home. Not beautiful people, usually what you might think of as ugly people. But he takes the time to look at these things, both whether it's ugly people or ugly things, and by giving some attention to them and focusing on them, he not only sees their beauty and their importance, but then he causes us as viewers to stop and to see the beauty and importance of what we might think was ordinary or ugly or uninteresting, unimportant, right? Another artist who admires Andrew Wyeth, his name is Bo Bartlett, and he wrote about Andrew Wyeth, and he said, Andrew Wyeth was a contemplative. Regarding the patience it takes to discover a painting, he would sit for hours looking. He said, if you sit long enough, the life will appear. Wyeth wasn't just painting pretty barns. He was painting the world around him, quote unquote, before it would disappear. So he's trying to capture something that was fleeting so that we might also see it and appreciate it. And so here I think there's some moments in David's life that are just like, well, let's pass by that and get to the good stuff. No, let's focus. Let's take some time to look and to see what this text is telling us. Because, as we mentioned, it's probably here for a reason. And if the author put chapter 10 before chapter 11, right? And we know what happens in chapter 11. We're about to enter that season in David's life of his great fall, his tragic sin, and the results that come from that in his family and in the world around him. So it's maybe no accident that this chapter's here. What can we see in this chapter that might warn us about what David's about to do and encounter as he's heading into this time of terrible decisions and tragedy, right? Maybe there's some things we can be prepared for in our day-to-day lives so that we make the right choices and we see the bigger picture even in the midst of what we think are the smaller moments, right? The everyday challenges and difficulties. So how can we be faithful in this meantime, right? Between what seems like the more important seasons of our lives. So I think the first thing we see is this reminder, this warning, don't spurn the kindness of the king. And so we see in verses 1 through 5, David's kindness. Verse 1, now it happened afterwards that the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun his son became king in his place. Then David said, I will show kindness to Hanun, the son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. Now, I like how this starts. Now, it happened afterwards, okay? Now, that in Hebrew is Vayahi acharei chen, okay? And it happened after this. And you would think, okay, is that a chronological marker? We see this same exact phrase in Hebrew at the beginning of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 8. And so some people will tell you that this isn't necessarily setting this in chronological order. In fact, if you read this events about some of the battles in this chapter, you'll realize, wait, didn't this happen already in chapter 8 when he fought against the Arameans? He fought against Hadad-ezer. Well, yes, at least the information was collected there for a certain purpose, and the author is collecting and telling us what's happening here as well for a certain purpose, but now he begins to put it into context with where does that battle fall in the scope of David's life and what happens on either side of that. So the context is what? Well, the context is the national events, the military crisis that's going on for Israel, but it precedes the crisis that David is about to find himself in. So once again, take heed to what's going on. Open your eyes. This also connects us to the previous chapter, however, chapter 9, because that opened when David said, is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show kindness for the sake of David? And that Hebrew word for kindness is, as we said last time, chesed. Chesed, okay? You can translate that word so many ways. Kindness is one nice way to do that. But ultimately, this is a very important word in the Hebrew Bible that refers to God's covenant faithfulness, right? His love based on his promises and his commitment to his promise. And so this is the way David wants to live his life as a king, as a covenant-keeping king, which I think he sees as a reflection of the covenant-keeping God. So David wants to show kindness because he has been shown kindness. And like the previous chapter, he wanted to honor the son of a father with whom he had a relationship. Chesed is also a term that is, well, we mentioned covenant, right? Relationship. Covenants are not just like biblical covenants between us and God, but people make covenants as well. David had made a covenant with Jonathan. And David apparently made some kind of covenant with Nahash. Do you remember Nahash, the Ammonite? He comes up in chapter 11 of 1 Samuel. Let me just read that verse real quick. Not really a great guy, so I'm trying to figure out what the covenant was between David and Nahash. But in 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 3, actually let's start with verse 1. Now Nahash the Ammonite came up and besieged Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you." But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, I will make it with you rather, on this condition, that you gouge out the right eye of every one of you. Thus I will make it a reproach on all Israel. So the elders of Jabesh said to him, let us alone for 7 days, and we might send messengers throughout the territory of Israel. Then if there's no one who will deliver us, we will come out to you. So that's Nahash. He wasn't a great guy. He didn't seem to love Israel, unless they were all, eyeless, and he could kind of rule over them. What happened in that case was that's what really caused Saul to step forward and show his mettle, right? He fought against Nahash, defeated him, and really delivered the Jabesh Gileadites. And so, Gileadites, excuse me. So, what could be the relationship between David and Nahash? Some people would say, well, if David was on the run from Saul, then maybe Nahash had made a pact with him, right? My enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think that might have been the mode that he was thinking of. Or it could have been this, that because Saul had defeated them, maybe now Nahash was under a covenant or a treaty with Israel, that they had to be subservient to the kingdom of Israel. And now David, as the king, is thinking, well, okay, they are my vassals, and I'm going to honor and respect that relationship. And so when his father died, he sent to Hanun his consolers, right, ambassadors, to go meet with him. Well, whatever the relationship, again, we see David is behaving consistently, both as a man and as a king, in his desire to be faithful, to show chesed, covenant faithfulness. It's interesting, too, that in chapter 2, it's to those very men of Jabesh Gilead that he first desires to show this covenant faithfulness. They treated Saul's body with respect. I want to show respect to them. Now he's speaking to their enemy, or to the son of their enemy, and saying, look, he's shown kindness to us, or chesed. I'm going to show kindness or chesed to them. So David doesn't seem to be partial. He's going to show the same chesed, whoever he needs to show that to. But his kindness, as we see in verse 2, is met with suspicion. It says in the last part of verse 2 in chapter 10, but when David's servants came to the land of the Ammonites, the princes, or the sarim, right? Sar is a prince, or it could be a military leader. The princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun, their lord, do you think David is honoring your father because he sent consolers to you? Has David not sent his servants to you in order to search out the city, to spy it out, and to overthrow it? So they don't trust David, even his kindness, his act of covenant loyalty. We see this a lot in the scriptures, especially among people who are kind of unsteady in what they stand for, that they have these advisors who come along with usually bad advice. And sadly, all too often, these leaders take the bad advice. And so what do? They dishonor David's desire to honor them. Naturally, of course, if you think David is trying to play by God's rules, what do you think the people of the world are going to do in response to that? They're going to think, that doesn't make sense to me, right? That's foreign. And therefore, they're going to fight against that. I think that'll happen in our lives as well. As we show God's standards to people, as we show God's love, we may just get a negative response to that. Don't be surprised if the world reacts to God's kingdom behavior that way. And so what happens? Chapter 4, David's envoys are terribly humiliated. So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half their beards and cut off their garments in the middle as far as their hips and sent them away. There's a lot of scholars who believe that this is, you got to wonder which half of the beard. I had this discussion earlier this week with somebody, and most likely it would have been right down the middle, like let's just make this as demeaning and humiliating as possible. And of course, David sent these men to do what? To console Hanun after the death of his father. There's a tradition of mourning in the Jewish world, and sometimes that involves shaving your beard, and oftentimes that involves rending your garments, right? Those two very acts that they take and say, you know what, let's pervert those. Let's insult you with those very acts of mourning and consolation. Instead, let's shave off half your beard. Let's cut off half your garment to the waist, so it's not like just a tear, but this is exposing these men and kind of whacking them on the back as they sent them shamefully out of town. How terribly humiliating that was. And these are also not just ordinary garments. Think about it. Men of Israel were meant to wear garments that had the tassels on them, which reflected God's law, God's word. And so this was cut off as not only an insult then to these people, but to the God of Israel, to his kingdom. So you can imagine the rage that King David was feeling at this time. What do you think is his response? What would be your response? I'd be like, get out of my way, hold me back. I'm going to tear these people apart for the insult to not only these men, but to me and to my kingdom and to God, the God of Israel. But what's amazing is instead of a swift and strong retaliation, David takes a moment to go meet, or at least to send and meet with these men in verse 5. It says, when they told it to David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly humiliated. And the king said, stay at Jericho until your beards grow, and then return. These men had been shamed, and if they had come home in this condition, it would have been an everlasting shame. David said, look, you come over the border here, pause. Jericho is like the first big city you get to. Stay, wait, take some time. And he just has this message of compassion and kindness for these individuals. He makes that his first priority, which I think is a good reminder to us of the kindness of the king. We have a great, kind king as well who cares for us and our situation. He's not just saying, look, I have this big major plan, get out of the way, you're bothering me. No, he's like, he sees our needs. He hears us when we call, right? That's the words of the song. But Hanun was foolish in his response to David. David desired to console him after the loss of his father, but look how he responded. It was kind of a gamble, right? You could just say, look, I'll send these people away with a big insult, and what if David doesn't do anything? Wouldn't that be great? Then we'd know he's weak, and then we can just come at him at other times. They're sort of testing the water, perhaps, So like I said, it's a great gamble. Well, their gamble did not pay off because David does respond and Israel does respond. So again, as we talked about, the people of this world, they can't appreciate God's standards and the standards for his people. And as a result, their actions and their attitudes towards us is just foolish over and over again. And sometimes they're testing our boundaries too. How will they respond? And so the question is, will we respond in a God kingdom-like way and in grace? Also, will we respond, as David's going to respond, standing up for what is true and what is important, that defending God's glory and God's honor. But all these events are just sort of a prelude, as we mentioned, to what's coming. Setting the stage for not only David's battle externally against these nations, but his internal battles in the time of trouble that's coming. But again, this is something we can learn from Hanun, right? Because he spurned the kindness of the king and thought he could push his boundaries and see how far he could go. How often do we push God's boundaries, right? And spurn his kindness for all the grace that he so abundantly poured into our lives? And do we take that for granted? And do we put him to the test with some of our behavior and some of our actions? Or do we stop and acknowledge and receive God's grace, right? So don't be like Hanun, but receive the kindness of the king and do not spurn it. We move on to see that the next portion is really about seeing the situation we're in. And you'll see that that phrase seeing comes up a lot. But I think we need to see, but also see again. We need to keep looking, just like the artist would just keep looking until he finally saw what he had to see. We need to keep our eyes open and keep looking. Because when you read this passage, pay attention to the words that the author uses. He comes up with the word see over and over again, all right? He says in verse 6 and verse 14, the sons of Ammon saw. Later on, verse 15, the Arameans saw. Verse 19, all the kings saw, right? There's this seeing that goes on. But then there's also their response to what they see, which kind of develops a sense of like these immediate crises in the passage. What do you see and what are you going to do about it, okay? Especially when it comes to what is going on all around, the Ammonites, the armies, and what they see. How do they respond? Verse 6, now when the sons of Ammon saw that they had become odious to David, the sons of Ammon did what? They sent and hired, let me get all these numbers right. They sent and hired the Arameans of Beth Rehob and the Arameans of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Ma'acha with 1,000 men, and the men of Tov with 12,000 men. So they thought, oh boy, David's not going to be happy, right? Now we're odious in his sight, or in his nose, I guess. But what are we going to do now? Well, let's, at great expense, hire a mercenary army so big that we can try to fight David. In 1 Chronicles chapter 19, which is a parallel to these events, it says in verse 6 that the king paid 1,000 talents of silver, which is, I guess, well over $1 billion in our money today. So he paid pretty handsomely to try to cover his mistake. I think if you go to the museum, the Oriental Institute is a biblical historical museum there. We went on a field trip a few weeks ago. They have clay tablets and cuneiform and writing from the ancient Near East. And you'll discover that the Arameans like to downplay some of their mistakes, right? They would say, well, yeah, we had this fight, but let's move on. Let's talk about the victories. And I think here they're trying to downplay some of their defeats and say, well, let's see what we can do here. Maybe we can still pull something out of the hat if we go and attack David. But they see what's going on, and what do? They try to compensate for that. They see the situation they've gotten themselves into, and they scramble to react and try to find a solution. I mean, I don't know if that's starting to kind of sound familiar to anyone. Do we ever look at what's going on in our immediate circumstances, and we sort of see the situation, and we make an assessment, and what do? We say, I got to fix this. How am I going to fix this? What am I going to do? I got to scramble. I got to put these things here and do this. And we try to fix things in our own strength. Like the psalmist says, don't trust in man. And we don't take the time to take a deeper look at what's going on. In this middle portion of text, we see this verb over and over again, see. So what does David do? He doesn't see, by the way, in verse 7. It says, when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the army, the mighty men. So the sons of Ammon came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the city. I do have a map to help us see what's going on here. Down here is Jerusalem, where David's men are coming from. This is Rabbah, the city of the Ammonites, and most people believe that was Rabbah, which later was rebuilt and renamed Philadelphia, and we read about that in the New Testament. But also, today it's Amman, Jordan. So it's not too far from Israel, but that was the capital city of the Ammonites. And this is likely where David's army drew up into battle. But what do they find when they get to the city? They find not only the Ammonites arrayed at the entrance to the city, but it says the Arameans of Zobah and Rehob and the men of Tov and Maachah were by themselves in the field. In other words, they walked right into it like a pincer move. They had the army in front of them of the Ammonites, And Joab and all his army arrives. And by the way, it says all the army of Israel is what David sent. All the army, the mighty men. So it's a big move. Perhaps it's a really important threat. And so David sends all the men, and there they are, suddenly, between a rock and a hard place as they hear the sound of troops coming up behind them. And so Israel is really at this point of existential threat, right? Will they survive? Because if this army goes down, who will defend the people in the cities of Israel against these people, I'm sure, who would love to take over that part of the land and rule there? I think we see the same thing today in the land of Israel, don't we? With its enemies all around. Last week we talked about Purim and the Persians and their desire, or at least certain of them desiring to destroy the Jewish people. We see that today in the land of Persia, making alliances with all sorts of nations around, aligning themselves to pose another existential threat to Israel. So the question is, will Israel survive? And I'll give you a hint. The story of Purim, right? Israel will survive. God has a great promise. He will preserve his people. But think again of this military campaign, which is so minimally described here in this passage. The army arrived, and there they were arrayed. But again, imagine them pulling up to the city. I have a few pictures. Well, this is a Gustave Doré illustration of David attacking the Ammonites, but just imagine that's Joab. There's the wall of this city. I think Doré was just imaginative. He probably didn't have a lot of archaeological evidence to know what the city looked like. But it was a large, fortified city, the capital of the Ammonites. And this is what we can see in the city of Amman, Jordan today. On the left side of the picture is the hill, which is ruins from ancient Rabbah or Philadelphia. And then across the valley, you see the sprawling metropolis of Amman, Jordan today. So it was a hilly, densely populated and very fortified city that Joab and his troops pulled up to. Another picture of some of the walls of ancient Rabbah, if this is the city that we're talking about in chapter 10. So those pretty thick walls. I don't know how Joab felt. He probably thought, we can do this, but then he had to take a second thought when he heard the sound and saw the size of the troops that had amassed on the field behind him. So what does Joab do? Verse 9 and 12, kind of the centerpiece of this passage. Now when Joab saw the battle was set against him in front and the rear, he selected from all the choice men of Israel and arrayed them against the Arameans. But the remainder of the people he placed in the hand of Abishai, his brother, and he arrayed them against the sons of Ammon. So he said, look, I'm Joab, right? I'm the killer general. I can pretty much take on anybody. So I'll take the best of our men and face this giant army of Arameans. My brother Abishai, you take the guys in front of their city, the Ammonites, all right? But the nice thing is, we'll be fighting kind of back to back. So if we got to communicate with each other, we'll know how to deal with the situation. If you get beaten down, I'll come help you. If I need help, you'll come to me. Whereas the Ammonites and the Arameans were on the far side of the battlefield, so they probably didn't have the same kind of lines of communication that Joab had. And so, in the heart of this passage, what does Joab say? He gives them this speech. Again, repeating this, if the Arameans are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the sons of Ammon are too strong for you, then I will come to you. But here in verse 12 is his rousing battle speech. Be strong and let us show ourselves courageous for the sake of our people and for the cities of our God. Have we ever heard that before in the scriptures? Be strong and courageous. Echoes of Joshua chapter 1, where God is telling Joshua, be strong and courageous. At another critical moment in Israel's history, God is saying, I'll be with you. Enter the land, be strong and courageous. And Joab decides it's time to tell his brother and his people, be strong and be courageous. And again, fight for the cities of our God, for the people of Israel. Because without us, they're toast now as well. But then what he says is the most important part of this passage. May the Lord do what is good in his sight. And you might wonder, why is Joab, of all people, saying this, prayer of faith all of a sudden. Joab's this hard-bitten, kind of do what it takes to survive, look out for number one kind of general. And here he is calling out on the name of the Lord and on his sovereignty and trust seems to be trusting in him. We don't usually hear these kind of things out of the mouth of Joab, but here we do. And here it's so important because, again, of the pinch they're in. Now, is this just like a foxhole prayer? Is Joab just saying, look, I don't know what's going to happen. This might be the end. Let's see if God will help. I don't know. I don't think so. I think this is more of a declaration of faith, because the Hebrew isn't just, may God do what is right in his sight. The Hebrew, it can be translated that way, but it's also, God will do what is right in his sight. And of all the words to use, Joab uses a phrase about sight. It's like, look, I see what's going on, verse 9. When Joab saw the situation, the Arameans saw, the Ammonites saw, and they all did their thing, but God sees, and Joab acknowledges God has a sight of all of this. He has the sight that we don't have, that we need to trust in and call on at this time. The Lord sees above what any of us can see, right? So when you can't see a way out of your own predicaments, what should you do? Is that when you scramble and try to fix and reposition your life? Or is it when you just call on the Lord and say, God, you must be able to see what I can't see in this moment. And help me to trust in you. If I can't end up seeing what you can see, at least help me to trust that you can and that you will bring about what is right in your eyes. And that will be right for me. And this passage and this situation that we might find ourselves in made me think of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, where it says, no temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. Now, the Greek word for temptation there, by the way, isn't just necessarily, oh, that thing is tempting to me, but it's the Greek word pyrasmos, which means a trial or a testing, okay? So let's think of this passage as saying you can be put in a trial and you could be in a test, but no trial or test has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not only allow you to be tempted or tested beyond what you are able, but with the test, with the trial, will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. So in these moments of crushing moments, perhaps, just what do? It's when we when we trust in the Lord in these crises, and we don't scramble to make our own method of coping or escaping, but know that God is the one who will do what's right in his sight. And the result, at the end of this moment, Joab and the people, verse 13, who were with him, drew near to the battle against the Arameans, and they fled before him. They just fled. Okay, you don't get any more description of the battle, but all you need to know is God must have heard this prayer because his enemies fled. And when the sons of Ammon saw, these other guys back on the other side of the battlefield, saw their coalition just disintegrating, what did they do? They also fled, and they ran into their city to hide. Joab says, you know what? It's been a hard day. We're not going to take the city now. I don't think we're prepared to do that. We got a little surprised here. We had to rearrange our battle plans. Let's go back to Jerusalem. Drop some new plans. We'll come back to fight another day against this city. And they will come to the city of Rabbah. The next portion, I asked the question, well, what do we need to do to be prepared in these times of these kind of in-between times, of are we being faithful to the Lord? And I think the response is yes. We need to not only not spurn the kindness of the king, we need to not only, I'm trying to remember my points, not only see again and pay attention to God, what God sees, but we need to just return to the king, all right? Now, this is where David finally steps out of his resting place, and he comes to battle. So you could call this part the return of the king. I think that title's already been taken. But I think what we need to take from this is that we should return to the king. Verse 15, when the Arameans saw, here it is again, that they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together. And Hadadezer sent and brought out the Arameans who were beyond the river, and they came to Chelam, and he put Shobach, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, in front of them to lead them. So don't you love it when people think, boy, I just failed miserably yet again. I know, let me do it again. Let me do it all over again. I think they define that as insanity, right? When something, the same results happen again and again, and yet let's do the same thing. And so that's what these Arameans seek to do. They didn't get beat bad enough the first time, so let's try this again. And again, we know from history they like to downplay their defeats and try to find a way to celebrate their victories. So they seek to destroy Israel yet again. Now maybe they just need to prove themselves. Hey, we can't be seen as the losers in this fight. Or they realize, no, David's really mad at us now, and perhaps we need to preemptively prepare for that. Let's gather another large army, because it turns out David's not as weak as we hoped. And so we're reintroduced to Hadadezer. Remember, again, I told you in chapter 8, he was introduced. And so that chapter gave us a little bit of a spoiler of what would happen here, because David does defeat them. But he was clearly a very powerful and influential king of the Arameans who could reach out to other tribes or under kings, to come and fight for him. Brought him all the way down from the territory of Elam. And as you see here, this is all of Aram, and some people came from beyond the Euphrates to Chelam, which is all the way on the bottom edge, close to Israel. And that's where they were gathering. And so that's where David realizes he has to go and meet them. So again, David, rather than seeing, earlier he was told, and now in earlier he hears of the problem. Now in verse 17, he's told. This is told to David. And so he gathers all Israel together, once again, all Israel, all the army. And they cross the Jordan, and they themselves go to Chelam. And the Arameans arrayed themselves to meet David and fought against him. But what happens? Well, the Arameans fled before Israel. Okay, not much description of the battle. David shows up, and as usual, when David shows up, your enemies flee. Not only do they flee, but David really strikes a crushing blow to them as he kills the 700 charioteers, the 40,000 horsemen, strikes down and kills Shobach, their commander. I mean, for this guy to get his name put in the Bible, he must have been a pretty important and impressive Aramean general, but now he's gone. And so David defeats the enemies. And in verse 19, as we kind of close the chapter, we return again to that phrase, to see, all right? When all the kings, the servants of Hadadezer, saw that they were defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel. So they saw, right? Saw that they were defeated by Israel. They made peace with Israel and served them, so the Arameans feared to help the sons of Ammon anymore. What's fascinating to me is this sort of reversal of what was going on. In fact, the verse itself is chiastic. We've talked about that word over and over again. A chiasm is based on the Greek letter chi, which is shaped like an X. So the events at the beginning mirror the ones at the end, and they kind of meet in the middle. And I broke down this verse for you here to show you, if you can read that, just how each clause of the verse parallels the others. It opens up with the word when they saw, and in Hebrew it's vayeru, all right? To see, ya'ar. When they saw, that is, the servants of Hadadezer, and the word servants is also echoed here, which is funny. Then what? Then they saw that they were defeated by Israel. They made peace with Israel. Now the script flips, right? And became servants of Israel, no longer servants of Hadadezer, and were afraid. Curiously, the Hebrew word for "and they were afraid" is exactly the same Hebrew word as "and they saw," vayeru. So even though contextually it's saying now they're afraid to help the Ammonites, it's echoing that same word about how they can see with maybe new eyes at this point. And so, right, they saw the situation, they saw their circumstance, and they realized things have to change. And so indeed they do as they reverse the course as they say, look, we can no longer be vassals or servants to Hadadezer. Now that David defeated us, we can kind of, transfer that treaty and give it to David. They become servants, vassals of King David. And David and Israel expands its strength. And of course now, next time they face the Ammonites, they know, oh good, these guys aren't going to come and bother us. We can just focus on those enemies. So I guess this leads us to our conclusion and our question. When we see the situation, as we mentioned before, around us, maybe it's a state of crisis. Yeah, maybe we try to react, right, by putting out fires, by making solutions of our own. But if we keep reacting the same way and seeing the same results, what does that define? Insanity, right? Why are we doing that? So despite what we see in our circumstances, whether we think we can be successful or whether we're just in utter dread of total disaster, we have to remember, stop and see with new eyes that the Lord will do, not may do, but have confidence the Lord will do. What? Will he do everything we want him to do? No, not necessarily. But will he do everything that's right in his sight? Yes, he will. So when we see that our decisions continue to lead to disaster, it's time for us to do what the Arameans did. Flip the script. Say, you know what, I'm not going to keep putting my trust and serving this thing that's leading me down the wrong road. I'm going to turn it to the Lord, to David's great son, Yeshua the Messiah. I want to stop fighting and enter into that new covenant, that new treaty with him, because that will transform my life. Even if I'm his servant, I'm much better off than being a servant to myself and to my sins. Lord will come into the midst of our circumstances, and his Holy Spirit will be there as well. So, we know what happens next to King David. He causes what happens next himself through his own decisions. And so we sort of have this chapter as the gift of hindsight to ask us, well, how can we be warned against what would happen in an event like that? So the behavior that comes later sort of pre-colors the events of this chapter. And again, everybody in this chapter seems to be reacting to what they see. Ammonites and Arameans reacting in foolish ways. Joab reacting shrewdly with military skill, but also acknowledging it's the Lord who sees. And by contrast, David is not described as seeing anything. So this is my warning as we look at, well, how could these things happen to David? For some reason, the author didn't use the word see for David. He uses hear, he's heard, and he's told, but he doesn't see. And as a matter of fact, for most of the chapter, he's not present in the fray, right? He sends people. He sends his emissaries. He sends his army. He sends people to meet. And so David's at a distance. And then ultimately, he's not the one who's calling out about God's faithfulness, but of all people, it's Joab. So David is at a distance. And I think this might be a condition he's in as we enter chapter 11 and find out what happens as he doesn't give the Lord any, second thought and heads headlong into his sin. So this should raise some alarms as we ask ourselves, where are we? What are we struggling with in our lives? How are we responding in these moments? Between the big chapters of our lives, how are we behaving? Are we just relaxing? Are we like, you know what? This isn't a big deal. I can cruise through this part of this chapter of my life, right? But, the enemy doesn't cruise or relax at this point. We're told in 1 Peter that he prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. So he's not relaxing even if we are. And we, therefore, I think, need to be on the alert to keep our eyes open for warning signs, but also for God's grace, for his kindness. Keeping our eyes open for just to seek him and to see what he sees and ask him to guide us through that. And then we need to turn our hearts back to the King, because Yeshua says in Luke chapter 16, this is where we find ourselves in the in-between times, right? In the maybe not the glamorous chapters, but Yeshua said, "He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in the very little thing is unrighteous also in much. So may God help us to be faithful even in the little things in between and not to be unrighteous. But God, help us to be righteous. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for your word, even what would seem like a flyover chapter, God. You want us to land there and spend some time looking for warning signs to us, but also looking for your grace to be present. And Lord, not only in this chapter and in this text, but in our lives, we ask for your grace to be present, for you to help us see what we can't see in our flesh. Lord, to look to you because you have provided for us your love, your grace, and hope, Lord. God, I also just want to lift up to you the rest of this day as we go out today, that you would fill us with your Spirit. Help the word to sink into our hearts. God, if anything given in this message was not from you, I pray you would speak over that, Lord, by your Spirit and through your word to our hearts, so that we might see where you are, where we are with you. Lord, lead us to your covenant faithfulness, that we might also be faithful, Lord. Let's pray this in Yeshua's name. Amen.